Hi, and welcome to VIBEZ Daily. This is a daily devotional curated by VIBEZ Church to help you practice the way of Jesus and be all that God has called you to be. You have joined us for our year-long series titled Devoted. Acts 2:42 tells us that the followers of Jesus were devoted to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking of bread, and to prayer. This podcast was created to provide context and commentary for what you read each day. Just before our friends begin discussing today's reading, we want to invite you not only for fellowship, but for prayer as well. We have created the Vibe Daily Chat group to offer you fellowship and a community where you can state your observations, ask questions about the reading or the podcast. You can join us by downloading the VIBEZ Church app in your favorite app store. Click Join the Conversation and join us today. And finally, we hope that you can join us for prayer. Prayer happens Monday through Friday, and more information on that can be found on the VIBEZ Church app under prayer. Now, let's begin our conversation on today's reading.
All right, welcome back to the VIBEZ Daily Podcast. It is day 72. We are continuing in our year-long series through the entire Bible. We are here in Judges, and so excited that you've joined us. Pray that you're reading along so that you can keep up with what we're reading. But yeah, we're here in Judges chapter 6. I am back and joined by my friends Matthew and Vonice, who are with us. I got a shout out. Came all the way from Raleigh, North Carolina to be with us and record with us this week. And so excited to have you guys and your thoughts and as you're sharing with us. But yeah, we'll jump right into Judges. Again, picking up here at chapter 6. We left off with Deborah yesterday. She was kind of the last main judge that we heard from, took over chapters 4 and 5, was all about Deborah and her story. But as Vonice mentioned, there was peace for 40 years kind of after Deborah conquered. But after those 40 years, the Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord yet again, right? It's how we kind of start here in chapter 6.
Yep.
And this time it's the Midianites' turn to conquer the Israelites. So, yeah, we get introduced to another judge that, again, kind of well known. If you've, again, been in church kind of for some time, you may have heard this story in some shape, form, or fashion. We get introduced to Gideon. What jumped out to you guys in Gideon's story, which kind of covers a couple chapters here, but let's just start with chapter 6. What jumped out to you guys about this?
Well, I like how it starts off that, the Midianites, pretty much were camped against the Israelites and they had no produce, right? And they had no sustenance, as my Bible says.
Yeah.
And then, of course, that's when they go, we're crying to the Lord, as they always do. And, of course, he sent a prophet to them. And here we have Gideon, right? So I like how it begins that way. But I thought it was funny because they were greatly impoverished, my Bible says.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they cried out to the Lord. And so, like the thing we keep saying is, something always happens and then they cry out to God and God will send them someone. And the theme of the book of Judges, right?
Yeah.
The consistency.
Yeah.
So getting it.
The Midianites are kind of painted as this kind of plague. They're described as locusts just coming out. Coming out and stealing everything. Basically, they do all the hard work. The Israelites do all their produce, all their crops and everything. So I mean, it's pretty devastating for them, I guess.
Yeah.
Interesting how it's kind of I don't know. I just picture them as being this plague. It's kind of a plague sample.
Yeah. No, I love that you two call that out, because if we go back to, I keep going back to Deuteronomy because Deuteronomy is significant in this, right? Like, if you go back to Deuteronomy at the end, I think it's like chapter 28-ish, is when Moses gives like the blessings and the curses. And if we recall, like, these are the curses literally playing out, right? It's the plagues, it's the locusts, it's your produce won't grow, it's you'll be conquered or handed into the hands of your enemies. Like literally we're just seeing that play out. And so it is important. I'm glad you guys are calling out, like, okay, it's not just that they're being conquered, it's also that they're impoverished. It's also that, we're going to get people aren't gonna be having babies, and I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that, like, this was literally the promised curse that God said, if you turn from me or if you disobey, this will happen. And so, yeah, it is a big deal that they're in poverty, and that's ultimately what leads to them crying out to the Lord. But yeah, he does answer. He raises up somebody and he calls Gideon, another unlikely guy. As we kind of mentioned yesterday, Gideon says back to the Lord, like, no, it can't be me, right? Like, this is verse 15. He's like, please, Lord, how can I deliver Israel?
Right.
Look, my family is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the youngest in my father's family.
Right.
Like, I don't even come from a strong tribe, and I'm not the strongest in my own family. So, like, why me? So you have a kind of another unlikely person that God raises up. What do you guys think was interesting about Gideon and kind of his story as God calls him?
I think it's interesting because, you know, God had to encourage him. He was weak. He was weak sauce. Like,
Comes to him, he's kind of trying to hide wheat before the Midianites get to him. So he's in the wine press.
Yeah.
He's being the wheat to hide it from the Midianites. Obviously, they're coming and raiding us. And the angel of the Lord calls him and says, "Oh, mighty man of valor." So he's mighty man of valor. And he's like, "Oh, I'm the youngest. I'm only the smallest tribe. I'm nothing really."
That's so good. That's so good.
And it's funny because in verse 14, God says, have I not sent you? Like, if God's giving you a word to do something, you don't think he's going to back you up? Like, he's like, nah.
Yeah, right. So that is so good. Like, isn't that just like God to identify who we are, right? To speak who we are. And then is it just like us to like not believe him?
Of course.
Right?
Yep.
Like, because as you said, he comes in and he's like, mighty man of valor. Like, you would think you would hear that from the angel of the Lord and be like, me? Okay, I'm a mighty man of valor. I'm feeling good about myself, right? But instead, he's like, oh, no. No, you must have the wrong person. You was looking for it. You took a wrong turn. You took a wrong turn at the wine press. Yeah. I was like, it's so like us, man, to just God. And you know, and I mean this like in depth, right? We look at scripture. Bible tells us we're fearfully and wonderfully made.
Yes.
And we'll be like, nah, son. You know what I'm saying? God will tell us like, you know, before you were created in your mother's womb, I knew you and I created you for a purpose. He's like, nah, son. You know what I'm saying?
Yep.
Like, we will hear these scriptures that you're more than a conqueror. You're the head and not the tail. Like, we'll hear these and be like, nah, God, that's not me.
Correct.
Like, I'm not that. I don't live up to that. And I think like that's what we just see in Gideon. Like, he hears the word of the Lord and he's just like, nope.
Yep.
Not me.
Right. And it's funny because God says you're going to defeat the Midianites as one man. And then he was like, well, if I found favor in your sight, show me that you're going to show me a sign that you'll walk with me. Right? Yeah. And then he prepares, right, an offering. And then the angel of the Lord, you know, strikes the staff with the meat and the leavened bread, and the fire rose out of the rock, right? Yeah. And consumed it. But I think he was still doubting after that. I don't think he still needs some more encouragement.
I don't know if he was bringing an offering. Maybe just bringing food for the angel of God. You know, he would. And then he sets it on fire as an offering. I don't know if Gideon was expecting it or not. But...
Yeah, because that's when he gets scared. Like, oh, son, okay. I have seen the angel of the Lord. Like, he didn't realize that pretty much until 22. He's just like, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face, right? So you're right. He first just thought, I'm bringing a meal to the guy and not realizing what's going on. But... Yeah, what you were calling out, Vonice, is why this is actually one of my favorite stories in scripture. Because I think, to your point, like, he does need a lot of encouragement, right? He reminds me a little bit of Moses when Moses goes back and forth with the bush, right? And he's trying to get, you know, God is like, yeah, go speak. And he's like, but I got a stuttering problem. No, like, you can do this. Okay, but what if they don't believe me? Like, no, like, you know, and eventually God kind of gets fed up with Moses. But it reminds me of that, but I love it because I think it's very human. Like, and it reminds me that like God can handle my like doubts and my insecurities, right? That he can handle that when I don't really believe and like I'm like, God, I need a sign. Like, he's willing to give me that sign. And then the reason I love it is because his sign is very specific, and I think it helps me to pray specifically. Like, you know, he doesn't just say, God, give me a sign, and then just look for something to happen and say, oh, that's a sign. Right. Like, because that's what we like to do. We just be like, Lord, give me a sign. And then anything that happens, we be like, oh, that confirms what I want it to happen. Right. Like, I'm just going to take whatever the next thing that comes that, you know, confirms what I wanted. But he's very specific. He's like, this is what I need to see happen. Right. If you want me to go, do it this way. It's something that's unlikely and that is specific. And if it happens, then I know the Lord is speaking. And it encourages me to pray in that same way when I am looking, when I'm not quite sure which way to go. Like, just ask for something specific and ask God to confirm it, and he will, right? Because he didn't have to. Like, God didn't have to. He could have been like, no, I said so. Go.
Right.
Like, he could be like,
Right.
oh, I said so already.
Exactly.
I don't have to prove myself to you. I'm God.
Right.
But he does. And I don't know. I love that about him.
But he's so gracious and merciful in that stead, because wouldn't that be annoying to be always questioned every time you ask someone to do something?
Oh,
like,
I have 4 kids. I'm very familiar with what that feels like. So yes, it is annoying.
oh my goodness.
Yeah.
But I love it, like how it says in verse 23, peace be with you, do not fear, you shall not die, right? So then he builds an altar, right? And then, you know, he asks him to tear down the altar of Baal, right? But he's still so chicken. Guess what he does? He grabs 10 companions, right? I think it's 10 people. And they did it at nighttime.
Right.
I mean, in his defense, I mean, he was kind of justified being afraid, because later on, they basically call him out and say, look, come here so we can kill you for tearing down.
Right. But you don't believe that God would have protected you regardless, day, night, lunch? I'm just saying.
I thought he'd be afraid too.
It's a legitimate reason to be afraid. But
Right.
you're right. He should have also had some confidence.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's good.
You got the Lord on your side.
Yeah.
Stand up for Gideon.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. Look, that's my guy. I'm with you, man. They even gave him a bad nickname, man. I was kind of mad at this Jerubbaal thing. I was like, come on, son. But yeah, that was really good. To your point, though, real quick, before I kind of move us in verse 24, I'm always fascinated by the names of God. So to see the
Right.
Lord is peace, like that's where we kind of get that name.
Yeah.
You know, I grew up learning a lot of those names, but to like always have the story that's associated with them, you know, is really good as well. So.
And I think it's funny because something my Bible mentioned goes, Gideon's name means the one who hacks or cuts down. A fitting name for the man whose first task Lord's service would be cut down the Baal's altar. That was cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about kind of the signs he asked for with the fleece at the end, kind of that specific sign he selected or desired. But going into chapter 7, God kind of does something back to him in a similar way, right? So, you know, Gideon asked for a sign to confirm, right, that this is it.
Yes.
And then God kind of gives him these signs to like narrow down his army. What do you guys think was what do you think was interesting about chapter 7? As God helps Gideon come up with this army to ultimately go and fight the Midianites, was there anything that just jumped out to you guys here in 7?
Well, I think something mentioned before we get to 7 was the sign of the fleece. I love that. Like, he's like, God, you know, first, you know, I'm gonna put a fleece of wool on the ground, and if the fleece has wet on, if they're doing the fleece only, then I know. And then he's like, okay, God, the next day, can you do the reverse of that?
Right.
So I thought it was interesting because we talk about how much encouragement he needs, right?
Yeah.
So I think that was a good point to point out at the end of chapter 6 before we hit chapter 7.
Yeah.
But then I don't know if this is when he picks up that new name, Jerubbaal.
Yeah.
Jerubbaal. Yep.
Yeah.
32,
Yeah.
chapter 6.
Yeah, and it says that Gideon acquired another name, Jerubbaal, which means let Baal contend.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. I thought that was very interesting there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'll say in chapter 7, kind of one of the first things that just jumps out to me is like God's purpose for narrowing the troops down, right? Because he says here in verse 2, the Lord says to Gideon, like, you have too many troops for me to hand the Midianites over, or else Israel might elevate themselves over me and say my own strength saved me. Right? And so like, I love that God is very aware of just our prideful nature, right? And our tendency to be self-reliant and to like want to take credit for stuff, right? And so he was just like, no, I gotta make this so impossible that the only way, like the only reason for your victory is me. Like, I need y'all to know the only person that did this is me, right? And I do wonder like how often God puts me in situations that like I can't depend on myself, because if I could, I would. Right. And so when I can't, like, I gotta say, okay, this is nothing but God that did this.
Yeah. I love that too, because, you know, he breaks it down in so many different ways, right? Whoever is fearful and afraid, let him turn into part, right? And then, of course, the drinking of water. I thought that was interesting. Because at first I'm like, lapping like a dog. Like, what does that look like? So some people are like, you know, scooping the water, drinking, and someone's on their hands and knees, like, lapping like a dog. Like, I couldn't imagine.
Yeah.
So many grown men.
Yeah, right. Over 9,000 of them, right? Pick that option. So
it's interesting.
Yeah.
Could you imagine that picture? Just like, you're like, what is going on here? Like how people are drinking water so differently.
Yeah, but I just also was interested in the overwhelming number of them did it that way, right? Like he went from 10,000 to 300 on that particular thing,
Isn't that
right?
crazy?
So yeah, an overwhelming number of them chose to kneel down and drink from the straight from the water.
It was like more graceful person, like not graceful, because I feel like most of the men were not graceful.
Hey man,
I mean,
what can we say? It's probably the most efficient way.
yeah,
You know, it seemed like a good idea to me. I probably would have been down on the knees too.
Oh my goodness, that's hilarious. Oh man.
Okay.
So yeah.
Okay, we'll talk about the battle. Anything that just jumped out to you guys here in 7? You know, they ultimately do go and conquer the Midianites and go into battle. Anything that just jumped out to you guys about how it played out?
I like how in verse 10, he still needed more encouragement. You know.
Yeah.
You know, he has to go down and hear them. You know, talk about how basically, you know, that they're going to be successful essentially. So I thought that was funny because of course he needed more encouragement. He goes, if you're not sure, and he's like, okay, we'll go down. You know, that constant reassurance for him. So the theme of Gideon.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think also just the fact that even with the 300 guys that you know God calls, they're not actually even doing the fighting. They have this whole routine where they have to have a lamp and, you know, a trumpet and what's it jaws, right? And so they make a big sound, and then the Lord set every man sword against his comrade, against all the army, and the army fled. So God did all the work, even with those 300 people. All they did was make some noise, and God used that to completely defeat them. So like,
that's real.
So basically, God didn't need anybody.
That's real. It's like Gideon could have went by himself and just blew the horn or something, right? Like, that's real. No, it's dope to see that because we saw that in Joshua a little bit. There's that battle where Joshua and the Israelites are fighting, and God actually kills more people with the hail from the sky than like the Israelites actually kill anybody. Like, so like you're right. Like God is literally like fighting on their behalf, not even just like empowering them. Like he's literally doing stuff to kill people that they don't even have to do it. So you're right. Like he said, he got all the way down to 300 and still didn't even need them. They didn't have to do anything. They just became a band. They just became the marching band to watch God go to work.
Yep.
It was good.
Oh,
okay. Well, at the end here, Ephraim, like that community kind of joins Gideon to help go after the Midianites. So he's kind of bringing some, adding some other people with him at this point. And I thought it was interesting that Ephraim kind of like takes offense. This is kind of going into chapter 8, but they kind of like take offense that Gideon went to war without them kind of thing. Like, it's just like, this is the beginning of verse 8 now. But it's like, why have you done this to us, not calling us when he went to fight against the Midianites? And they like argue with him. And I was just like, this is dumb. Like, if y'all was so eager to fight the Midianites, why don't you go fight the Midianites?
Right.
Like, why you gotta wait for Gideon to come get you if y'all were so eager? But I don't know, anything that just jumped out to you guys here as we go into chapter 8, as this war kind of continues to wage on.
I mean, the whole sort of issue there with not offering, asking for bread and then not giving him bread. I guess Succoth. I'm not sure.
Oh yeah.
In verse 5, chapter 8.
Yeah.
And it talks about just the flailing. I'm not sure what the I'm not sure what exactly the meaning is behind the story, but it's just interesting how that comes back to them, right? You kind of, so.
Yeah, no, that was interesting that like none of them was trying to, like, he's tired and exhausted. Nobody trying to give him no bread, give these people no bread, because they're like, you haven't brought us the kings yet, like, into our hands. I was like, that's cold, man. Right. Like you said, it comes back to him because ultimately he makes a threat. He goes and does what he's supposed to do, and they come back and, gets his revenge essentially. But
I think it's funny because this is when Gideon starts getting bold. He's like, okay, well, I said I'm gonna do it, and he does it, right? So I think it's interesting because his attitude starts to change.
Yeah.
As opposed to this timid guy, he's got the, the strength of many armies at this point. Like, all right, I have to do what I'm gonna say.
Yeah.
So he does it.
Yeah, which again reminds me of Moses. Like, it's interesting the parallels between them because to your point, they both kind of start off real timid and scared and needing that. But it felt like once they saw God start to show up for them, they started to gain confidence in like what they could do kind of with God. So you're right. Yeah. Now that he's talking trash. Like, you know, he wasn't talking trash before. Yeah. He's, like you said, hiding his wheat in the wine press before. Now he's all of a sudden talking trash to everybody. Like, yeah, and I can stand up and I'm going to come back to it. So. Yeah. Okay. Well, unfortunately for Gideon, pride gets the best of all of us. Because kind of here in the second half of 8, you know, they kind of take these gold earrings and they build this pretty much this idol or so. And it kind of becomes an issue for his household, right? The way that verse 27 reads it for me, it says at the end of it that like then all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it, and it became a snare to Gideon and his household. And then it's just the second half of Gideon's story here at the end of 8 that you guys thought was interesting.
Kind of just like we were saying, you know, here's this timid man and now he gets so prideful that he's like rising himself above to the point where now you're making an idol, right? That becomes a snare for your household. So it's the transformation, right? It's like, oh, I'm timid, I need God. And then he's like, okay. And then he's kind of like, I don't need God. I got this on my own, right? And now we have this whole idol. And I was like, you know, I just kept shaking my head.
True, and I think the Israelites got distracted from God. So I mean, like if you go to verse 22, they totally missed the point that it wasn't Gideon that saved them, right? It was God. So the men of Israel, they asked Gideon to be rulers, right, and to be their ruler. Your son and your grandson, for you have saved us from the hand of Midian. But I mean, he was just an instrument used by God. So.
Deep.
Yeah, they missed it. That's good.
I mean, but Gideon kind of corrects them a little bit there, so I'll give him credit there.
Slightly. But you know, he wanted the credit.
Still.
Right, yeah, because he still comes right after that with, but you know, bring me your earrings.
Yeah. Right.
Which I think goes to, I think it speaks to the idea that like we can't really even like flirt with like temptation and that kind of stuff, because ultimately like it seemed like to him probably a reasonable thing that like, no, God's gonna rule over you, I'm not, but here's a compromise, right? Bring me these earrings, and you know, this can be your show of gratitude, kind of for the part that I played. And it does show that like anytime we just kind of even give a bit of room for temptation, right? Like it'll rule over us, and it'll ultimately be a snare to us. And so, yeah, like ultimately he really should have just been like, no, God gets all the credit. Go build him an altar. Go worship him, right? Like that's what it really should have been. But it's like, I'll take a little bit of credit. Like God's gonna rule over you, but I'll take my payment. You know what I'm saying? You can pay me for it. And I think, it does give us that idea of like, we can't even play. Like, don't even flirt with that idea.
But it brings you back to like, you know, I think back in Exodus, right, when they made the golden calf, right? So similarities, they used gold earrings, didn't they? They just started worshiping the calf instead.
I mean, then they say this is what brought us out of the land of Egypt. This calf, as opposed to giving the glory to God.
So that's same similarities as their focus is lost.
Same issues over and over again. Nothing new is under the sun. We'll get to that in Ecclesiastes. But so at the end though, before we kind of move into chapter 9, because it actually does kind of, it's a big deal here, but the end 35 tells us like after Gideon dies, the Israelites, they don't remember God, right? 34 tells us, and they forgot that they had been rescued, you know, from their enemies, and they don't even show kindness to Gideon, like for all that he had done to Israel, right? Like they don't even show him any appreciation. And then we get to chapter 9, and man, talk about some family drama. Like chapter 9 is a little crazy.
Ooh,
with all these sons, and this son of one of the concubines, right? And kind of how that rises up. So talk to me about chapter 9. What sticks out to you guys about how this story goes?
Well, the son of Gideon, or Jerubbaal, as my Bible says, you know, has mother's brothers, right? So how many mothers and how many brothers? Let's start there. You know, we talk about, you know, how many like different the polygamy. There we go. So you have all these, because he had, was it 70 sons?
Yeah, that's what it says earlier in verse 30.
Yeah.
And so Abimelech over there, doing some wild stuff. He ain't got no family loyalty here. And so he basically had everybody killed except for the one that got away, which is Jotham, right?
Yeah.
So I thought that was wild. I mean, who wants to be in power that bad?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting to your point. Like, we see the issues with obviously the multiple wives, right? That's kind of one issue. But there's concubine as well, who's like not his wife. This woman on the side bearing him a son, ultimately becomes the real issue, right? The one that comes after all of his quote unquote sons. I mean, he's technically a son too, but the ones that will actually have some sort of inheritance. And so like it is. It's to me the consequences of our sin. Like that is just, this is what sin does. It breeds this kind of behavior. And unfortunately, like that is what, it meant the loss of all of his other sons except for Jotham. Right.
Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah. But Jotham does make a promise, that ultimately Abimelech is going to pay for what he's done. And then he also makes a promise not just to him, but to Shechem, right? To that land, essentially that kind of helped him, right? In that. Anything about how that plays out? Like, there's a story that kind of explains how that comes to pass here in the rest of 9. Anything about that you guys thought was interesting?
Basically, wasn't it kind of like a foretelling of how Abimelech was going to have his demise?
Yeah.
So I thought that was pretty cool. I had to read it a couple times. So I was just like, okay. Oh, he's out here. He's for real, And so I love how it kind of foreshadows like the downfall of Abimelech.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I just thought it was interesting that like what he kind of says will happen and what ultimately happens is that they essentially just like tear each other down, right? Like that they become the cause of their own demise, like between each other.
Right.
And so there's all these different like things that play out where they're thinking they're kind of like on the same side, but then they end up like against each other. And then like, they're thinking there's no real threat. Like the verse 36 was hilarious to me. It's just like they saw the troops and like, nah, man, it's just shadows of the mountain, right? They look like men to you, right? Like there's all these things that have just confused them to where ultimately they end up after each other,
right,
and whatnot. So,
but I think like the whole that downfall of Abimelech chap part, I think it was pretty cool because basically they were just like, oh, nothing's gonna happen, and they got them. Like they played them real good. It was a real good like war strategy, if I can say so. Yeah. So I think that was pretty dope. Basically he cursed Abimelech. It led to his death, right? And he sought to be better. But it was just really cool how it all played out.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing I just thought was interesting before we get to 10 is that like going back to the story of like Deborah and kind of what she professes that like, Sisera is ultimately going to die at the hand of a woman.
Yeah.
Like how big of a deal that was, because here at the end of 9, Abimelech almost dies at the hand of a woman, and rather than die at the hand of a woman, he goes and like essentially commits suicide. Like asks his armor bearer to kill him because it's just like it's so shameful and embarrassing to have died by the hand of a woman. I'd rather let my right hand man kill me, you know what I'm saying, and die, in friendly fire essentially, because I just don't want them to tell the story that Abimelech died by the hands of a woman.
But
like
technically you did though. I mean, like she pretty much started it. You just finished it.
Right.
But,
I mean, we all know the story. It's written right here. Okay, so we know what really happened to Abimelech. You thought you got away,
but you really did it. You really did it.
Yeah.
So. Yeah. I love that you brought that up because I forgot that part. Like, oh yeah. Because like, I don't want to know. A woman killed me. So.
Yeah. Trying to avoid that shame. But.
You're already shameful.
Yeah. So after Abimelech, 10 starts with after Abimelech, we kind of get a real two kind of short judges here, Tola and Jair. They're both around 20 or so years that they kind of lead Israel. And then, of course, the Israelites rebel yet again. And hey, man, God continues to kind of show mercy. But we got to have a pretty short chapter here in 10 compared to some of the others. But anything that just jumped out to you guys here in chapter 10?
I like how when they brought up the two, I would say minor judges, right? We don't mention any rest for the land, right? We see that he judged for 23 years and then he died, right? And then the other guy, he judged for 22 years and then he died. But, you know, normally we see them, they're judging and then there was some sort of rest.
That's
but
good.
We don't see rest after these minor judges.
That's good. Good. Call out. I didn't even notice that. That didn't stick out to me.
So I think that's something I noticed.
I noticed is, you know, when Israel cries out again in the middle of chapter 10, God kind of answers them and calls them out and says, "Look, you've been going after these other gods. Call out to them to save you, right?"
Not deep. Call your little God. Call your little God. Let them save you.
Like, who knew God was petty, man? Like, who knew God was so petty? Like, yeah, you read that and you're like, that's my God. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's real. That's where I get that from,
right.
God. That's where I get that from. Because, yeah, like, but it's real, man. Like, it should be, it's fair. It's a fair thing to say. Like, because it's how we treat God.
Right.
It really is. Like, we were like, God, I want all the blessings that you offer me, but I want to do what I want to do.
Correct.
You know? And so he's like, all right. And I mean, I've lived this, right? Like, yeah, if that's what you want to pursue, then let that save you.
Yep.
Like, let that be there for you in those times as well.
Right.
When you realize that it's not as good as you thought it would be.
I know. I put, oh, shoot, like when I put there.
I'm glad you wrote, oh, shoot, in your Bible. That's hilarious.
And then after 16, you know, I like, so they put away their foreign gods from among them and served the Lord. And his soul could no longer endure the misery of Israel. And I put, ouch. Like, he was done.
He cares, though.
He does, but he was hurt.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that brings us to end of today's reading. Here in chapters, we did 6 through 10 today, so we'll do 5 more chapters tomorrow. I feel like we are moving through these judges. There are so many of them. It's hard to kind of cover all of them in depth, but we got more. We got a few more that we'll get through here for these next couple of days. But again, thank you guys so much for joining us. Come back, join us tomorrow. We'll pick up on chapter 11. But until then, see you later.
Thank you for joining us for the VIBEZ Daily Podcast. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or download our favorite, the VIBEZ Church app. Visit vibes.church/devoted for additional episodes, notes, details, and the latest merch. Join us next time as we continue our journey through the Bible. Take good care.